What would a grid down and post-collapse economy look like? And would precious metals be at all useful in one of these scenarios? In today's video, we do a historical analysis of commodities exchange in both times of economic prosperity and crisis. We look at historical examples and real case studies to see whether or not gold and silver will actually have practical value in one of these predicaments. Let's get to it. So before we delve into this, let's address the common criticism that gold and silver have little value in a crisis situation. After all, you can't eat it and you cannot drink it. Well, you can due to its relative non-toxicity, but don't expect it to taste good, and it certainly isn't going to have any nutritional value. Without a doubt, before even considering the accumulation of precious metals, one should ensure that all of their bases are covered with regards to the commodities that actually meet primary needs: your food storage, your water storage, and the tools that you need to survive. But the question is, when, if ever, is it a good time to exchange your paper currency in for precious metals? Should you wait until you have 3 months worth of supplies, 6 months, 12 months, or should you even bother with precious metals at all and instead invest in something which is likely to have a higher return on your investment? Things like stocks, bonds, or real estate. For myself personally, gold and silver has never been at the top of my priority list. But I do think the idea has merit, and I'll explain my goals for precious metal hoarding later in this video. Food, water, shelter, security, medicine. Gold doesn't do anything for you with regards to these things. Therefore, its primary role is as a means to those ends. The only reason why you would have gold is so that you could procure those things in an SHTF situation. Now, in a post-grid down world, chances are those things are going to be in limited supply. And if you live in a world where there's a lot of demand and little supply, your gold is essentially going to be useless. That gold may be worth $1,500 an ounce now, and you can trade it in for $1,500 worth of those basic staple provisions that you're going to need. But when times are tough and when commodities are in limited supply, gold is going to be as useful as cash. It's not going to buy you much. Now, that doesn't mean that gold and silver don't have a place in prepping. They absolutely do. We're going to talk more about that later. Now, the extent of the collapse is going to determine the economic structure of a post-collapse world. If you look at how money has evolved as a means of exchange throughout the ages, all you have to do to know what it's going to be like in SHTF is to reverse this evolution of money. So for instance, in a grid down power outage situation, digital currency will be useless because the machines won't be working. People will revert to using cash. If people lose faith in cash in an economic collapse hyperinflation scenario, people will revert to precious metals or alternative currencies that still have their value. If people lose faith in precious metals, we go back to a barter economy. If people lose faith in barter, we go back to a hunter and gathering, every man for himself economy. Now, why is gold important anyways? In order to understand why gold is important, we must understand the history of our financial system. Barter and trade was the first form of commerce to emerge in human societies. Unfortunately, its ability to facilitate complex transactions is very limited. Barter economies exist in primitive societies by and large and emerge for numerous reasons. So in a hunter-gathering society, one person or one group basically performs all of these subsistence activities required to get enough energy off the land just to survive. All men and women are essentially jacks of all trades. But as people coalesce into larger and larger communities, they become more specialized in their occupations, and they gain mastery over the procurement, refinement, and creation of different resources and commodities. And thus people start to barter for the commodities that they've mastered for other commodities that they don't have. There are problems with the one-to-one barter system. For example, a barter situation requires that both parties must need what the other has. So let's say I have 10 fish and you have 10 loaves of bread, but you don't want fish, you want a cord of wood. So in order for me to get the bread that you have, I must first go and trade my fish for some wood, and then I can trade my wood for your bread. This could prove to be a lengthy exercise, and because there's no common measure of value, this is going to lead to a lot of haggling, a lot of bargaining, and inevitably a lot of disagreements between those who are trading. What's more is that there are a lot of goods which are indivisible. So let's say that you're a blacksmith and you make a sword. Well, that sword may be worth 10 loaves of bread, but you may not need 10 loaves of bread. So you may be forced to trade the sword for the 10 loaves of bread and then go and trade those individual loaves of bread, because they're more divisible, in for other commodities. The problem is, unlike the sword, the bread is perishable, meaning you have a limited amount of time now to trade that in for other goods. Due to the perishable nature of these commodities, within this type of economic paradigm, it becomes very difficult to accumulate wealth. Prior to the invention of money, there wasn't huge wealth discrepancies between people because it was nearly impossible to store wealth. So what people started to do is that they began to store things that people would always want. Instead of storing perishable items, they would store things like salt and various types of metal. And it was thought that this was the birth of the origins of money. Salt was very divisible, it was very long lasting, and it had a very condensed form of value. Hence the word salary, which comes from the Latin word for salt. So various commodities like salt then start to be used as a medium of exchange. And typically these are the commodities that lose the least amount of value over time. Now, gold and silver were valued for their aesthetic attributes long before they were ever used for money. From ancient Egypt to Greece to Turkey, gold was treasured as a hallmark of royalty. It was used for decorative purposes, and many people even thought it had sacred properties. So in this regard then, gold had what some would call intrinsic value long before it was ever associated with the monetary system. Now in 700 BC, that all changed when people started to use it as currency. Gold could be easily melted, easily formed, it was corrosion resistant, and it was also very rare, making it an ideal natural trading medium. It was a very dense and easily transportable form of intrinsic value. No matter where you were in the world, even civilizations which were far removed for millennia, all valued gold. Oddly enough, many cultures thought that gold came from the sun, and this coincides with recent findings that gold in fact came from an asteroid in outer space. Now, some of the unique qualities of gold is that it's non-toxic, and in fact, it's edible, even though there's no nutrient value. It's among the most malleable of elements, and a single ounce of gold can be beaten into a 300 square foot sheet. So for this reason, you don't need a whole lot of gold for decorative purposes. In the modern day, about 10% of gold is used in electronics and industrial applications. There has only been 152,000 tons of gold mined in all of human history. Now, it is said that there's more gold in the world above ground than silver. This is because most of the silver that is mined goes into industrial applications and gets used and consumed and ultimately sent to landfills. However, there's nearly 20 times more silver in the ground and almost 10 times more mined every year. But the statistic that there's more gold than silver above ground doesn't account for that which is privately held, as in the case with silver stackers. It's unknown how much silver is actually being hoarded, but chances are there's probably a lot more silver out there than people think, and thus it's not nearly as rare as gold. Gold's relative inertness and its extreme durability and corrosion resistance means that you could build something with it and be confident that 2,000 years from now, that thing would exist in the exact same form. You can't do that with most metals. Now, all of these amazing properties aside, hasn't prevented gold as a medium of exchange from being criticized. Many think it's actually an archaic practice. For example, Warren Buffett was quoted as saying, "We spend trillions to pull it out of the ground from Africa and put it in another hole in the ground somewhere else and then get people to guard it." Now, it's important to make the distinction between intrinsic value and intrinsic utility. Gold has what's called intrinsic value because we as a society, for all the aforementioned reasons, have chosen to value it. This implies that a commodity has a certain property in and of itself that defines its value. Now, intrinsic utility, on the other hand, is the actual objective usefulness of a thing. Although gold does have some intrinsic utility, for instance, it's useful as an unreactive electrical conductor, This utility doesn't justify the value that we as a society place on it. Furthermore, in an SHTF situation, without an elaborate manufacturing grid, gold will have very little intrinsic utility. Most of the value of gold comes from the fact that people essentially think it's valuable. Therefore, gold has some intrinsic utility, but it's a fraction of its intrinsic value. Many people have argued that the only reason why gold continues to have value is because it costs so much to get it out of the ground. For example, it takes almost $1,200 an ounce to mine an ounce of gold, which typically sells for $1,500. So what's going to happen in an SHTF situation? As previously indicated, gold will only become a valid means of exchange when there are surplus resources to trade for. If the crops are dying, if there are water shortages, if there's no medicine and there's no ammunition, gold won't be worth its weight because there'll be no commodities to buy. However, gold is not perishable, and unlike paper currency, it has been a far more stable holder of intrinsic value throughout history. So the prepper is faced with a dilemma. Do I spend $1,500 on commodities, most of which will either depreciate or degrade over time, or do I buy that 1 ounce of gold that may depreciate or it may appreciate somewhat, but it certainly won't degrade? But when the time comes for me to trade that in, I'm going to probably get a lot less commodities than I can now, because in times of abundance, that's when you're going to get the most for your gold. Your gold and silver may not be worth nearly as much in an SHTF situation as you think, especially in a global economic collapse situation. The best value you're going to get for that gold is when the production of these other commodities is highest, and that is right now. So say the grid went down and 6 months in you stroll into Bartertown to see what you can buy with your gold and silver. All of the commodities are going to be of lower grade quality. They aren't going to be guaranteed by any regulatory bodies that we have now, like the FDA or the FCC. And there won't be any manufacturer's warranty or guarantee. And it's quite likely that most commodities will be in very limited supply. So the only way you would get more for that gold is if we somehow magically reverted to a gold standard post-collapse. But the reality is you likely still wouldn't be able to get the high-grade products that you do now. So gold and silver, at best, are only supplemental to the cause of preparedness. While they are a hedge against hyperinflation, they're not going to put you in a superior position after the collapse. They're just going to minimize the loss. Now, if we look at the case study of Venezuela, Venezuelans have been selling their gold and silver in order to get commodities that they need. Most of this is in the form of jewelry. And in the style of economic collapse that they're undergoing, they're taking their gold to a pawn shop who then gives them either Venezuelan paper currency or US currency, and then with that currency they're going to buy commodities. So people aren't actually taking their gold and silver to a grocery store to trade it in for groceries. There may be some limited exchanges where that's happening, but based on the research I've done, most of it is traded in for cash, which people then trade in for commodities. So cash is still primarily the medium of exchange, even in a hyperinflation economy like that. And what's happening is that a lot of these pawn shops are not paying people what the gold is actually worth. One article about the Venezuelan crisis indicates that one pawn shop owner was paying people roughly $20 per gram of gold, which is about $30 under spot price, which is the set price that they would get in a lot of foreign markets. So that's proof that the value of gold that you hold is not going to be worth nearly as much as it is now, if those resources are even available. So going back to the question then of how much gold and silver should you store for SHTF, I can only speak to my personal goals. I think an ideal position for me to be in would be to have enough precious metals to carry me through a 3 to maybe 6 month scenario. I'm not talking about a Mad Max WW3 situation here. I'm talking about surviving the next Great Depression. If I have enough precious metals to pay my bills for 3 to 6 months, that would be a confident position for me to have. It is in no way, shape, or form a replacement for food, water, shelter, security, medicine, and all of the staple preparedness supplies that we talk about on this channel all the time. Now, I'm not here to give people financial advice I'm only here to speak about my own personal strategy. So don't take this as official financial advice. It really depends, in my opinion, on how much disposable income a person has. In my opinion, the majority of your disposable income should go towards getting the long-lasting, long-term preparedness supplies that you need right now that are as cheap as they're ever going to be right now, and the rest of it should go to investing in something that's actually going to create real returns. Now, while it's possible to get a good ROI on precious metals, it's very unlikely. The average price of gold, for instance, has only gone up about 1% a year for the last 100 years or something like that. And I think silver is even a lot worse. Now, if you have a sizable amount of income left after making some sound investments, investing in your retirement savings plan, your 401k, whatever the case might be, whatever you have in your country or the equivalent to that in your country, then it might not be a bad idea to put some money into precious metals as a mere hedge against inflation and economic collapse. But for myself personally, it's only ever going to be a very, very small percentage of my disposable income that goes into gold and silver, because a lot of these people who have stacked thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of silver, they could have invested that money in something else, and they could have had some real returns generated on the basis of that. So in a lot of cases, going into precious metals with your extra money, while the grid is up and we have a thriving economy, it's not the best financial decision you can make. The US economy has been in a bull market for the last 10 years or so. And if you had made the right investments throughout that time, you would be a lot wealthier than had you just put it all into silver or gold. I do think that a lot of people get into collecting silver and gold, and it turns into an obsessive hobby of sorts, which is banking on the price of silver tripling or quadrupling, which by modern expectations is quite unlikely. Now, it could happen that there's a new technology that emerges which really requires a lot of silver in order for it to function, and therefore the intrinsic utility of silver and gold even may go up substantially, and that may raise the price considerably. But to hope for that isn't a calculated financial decision. Most people would be fine and good if they never got into gold and silver at all. But like I said, for people who have an ample disposable income, after your basic needs are met, after your bills are paid, after your long-term food storage and other investments in the homestead aspects of your preparedness plan, after you've made your other long-term investments, then maybe put a little bit into gold and silver. But hoarding large amounts of gold and silver, if you are not a very wealthy person, in my mind is quite fiscally irresponsible. Perhaps you disagree, and maybe you can convince me otherwise. I am very open to refining my perspective on the role of precious metals in a SHTF situation. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. If you did enjoy this video, please like, comment, subscribe. If you disagreed, once again, please let me know. Thanks for watching. Have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Canadian Prepper out. The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com. Your one-stop shop for premium, high-quality, brand-name products that have been tried and tested by myself and other YouTube gear reviewers. My subscribers save 10% off by using the coupon code SURVIVALPREPPER. All one word in all caps. Have a Merry Christmas. Enjoy the time you have with your family, but stay ready.